Are you continuously topping off coolant in your EA839 equipped B9 Audi? I'm Rusty with FCP Euro, and I'm here to show you how to replace the water pump, thermostat, changeover valve, and associated components in the B9 Audi. In front of me on the table, we do have the complete kit with the water pump, thermostat, changeover valve, all seals, hardware, and coolant from concentrate. So aside from the obvious signs of your water pump leaking, you may have some staining around the bottom of the water pump visible from underneath the vehicle. There is a weep hole here which will leak under extreme duress of the vehicle. However, when they do start to really fail, you'll actually get some drips around the outside of here. And in a extreme situation, if the water pump has been leaking and you're not actually seeing anything on the car, it could actually be leaking from the vacuum line. And then you may not actually see any coolant leaking until it's too late. It's starting to cause other issues. Some other symptoms, which is why we've gone ahead and gone with the MAP thermostat as well as the changeover valve, is these technically also are vacuum controlled and can leak coolant into the vacuum system as well. Generally, you'll see some leaking around this cover, which I can pop that off of the old one once we get that one out. The MAP thermostat may have a series of faults related to temperature control and coolant regulation. So we're going to be going ahead and installing this along with the water pump, which is actually leaking on our vehicle. Typically, these have been replaced between 40 and 60,000 miles, where the old 4-bolt flange water pump will actually leak that coolant externally as well as internally. We don't really have too much information on the 6-bolt flange. So if you have a EA839 vehicle, take a look down the front of the engine, take a look at the top pulley, see how many bolts are on that pulley. If you have a 4-bolt flange, chances are you may need an entire overhaul of the cooling system. And with that, let's talk about some tools we'll need to take care of the job. For today's DIY, we will be using the UView coolant filling device when going ahead and refilling the cooling system, along with a 5-gallon bucket to mix our coolant concentrate. And then you'll also need something to drain the coolant into, not pictured here. I've got a 3M Brillo pad along with a dead blow hammer, a small plastic pry tool, a small metal pry tool, a 90-degree pick, a Phillips and flathead screwdriver, a couple of wheel hangers, a decent impact gun for removing the wheels, a blowgun for blowing away some of the coolant before putting everything back together, an impact gun with a T25, a 12-inch 3/8 extension, a small 2-inch 1/4-inch extension, a 1/4-inch ratchet, a 3/8 ratchet, a little bit longer 3/8 ratchet, a 1/2-inch ratchet, a torque wrench that's going to be capable of 9 Newton meters to 55 Newton meters, and then 140 Newton meters for the wheels, a good flashlight. We have a syringe for setting the coolant level. And then up front, I've got a magnet, which will definitely be handy to have. You may be wondering why I've got bolts on the table, but those will be useful for putting the vehicle into service position. Really, you'll just need a 4 to 5 inch bolt that is M10 by 1.5 for moving the radiator forward. In the front, I've got a couple of variations of a T30 socket, as you'll need different sizes and lengths. I've got an M6 by 1.0 thread chaser, along with a 10mm triple square, a T55 socket, a 7mm socket, a 13mm socket, a 16mm socket, and a 17mm socket. And with all that taken care of, let's go ahead and get into the repair. With a T25 and a T30, we're going to take the screws off of the bottom of the lock carrier here. And obviously, we already have our belly pan removed. With the coolant leak that we had, that foam just was soaked with coolant, so we're going to be putting a new one on in the end. If you do have your belly pan while you're underneath the car, T25s and T30s, we'll take it right off, and we'll be installing that later on to show you that as well. You can certainly get away with not removing the wheels and turning the wheel a little bit, but it's much easier to get the inside fender screws off with the wheels removed. With a 17mm, go ahead and take your wheels off. With a T25, we're gonna go ahead and remove some fender liner screws. You don't have to take all of them out. However, if you did remove the entire fender liner, it would probably give you a little bit extra room. I'm gonna go through and get just enough out so we can pull the liner back and access the main bumper hardware in this area. So quite simply, you just need to pull about 6 screws out and you'll have plenty of access to this bumper liner. There will be nothing else attached. You can leave this little flare here that does screw in there, but once you know that this panel is loose, the bumper should come right off. And do the same thing to the other side. Right before we're about to take this bumper off, there are 2 more fasteners on either side. There is this little clip here where you just need to pry up the center and remove the whole clip. And then there's a T30, which we'll show you in a minute here. It's a little bit further back. Do not take off the two 10 millimeters. That may look like that is what you're supposed to remove, so follow along. Now we're going to take out the T30 that you'll see very far ahead, and on this side, unfortunately, we have some AC lines in the way, so I'm going to be using a pretty long T30 bit. It's going to be a lot easier to take this out than fish that back in there, and then pull it out like a game operation. Once you've got those fasteners out, you just have to kind of gently, oh, we've got some debris that we've lost, but you got to pop it out of the clips here and kind of go forward, getting it out underneath the clips under here, and just leave this loose while we get the rest of the top of the bumper off. Both sides need to be kind of loosened up for you to take the rest of the bumper off from the center. So do the same thing on the other side, and we'll catch up with you guys in a second to go over the harness on the inside that we have to remove. Now that we've got both sides of the bumper loosened up, we're back over here on the driver's side. The harness connector that takes care of the PDC and any electronics in the front of the vehicle does have one connection here, so you can leave all the other connectors on and take off this one sub harness. Visually, this is a little bit difficult to actually get this off. Our vehicle does have an auxiliary radiator here and these additional AC lines, so if your vehicle does not have that, you'll probably have much more access than we do. I'm going to try to get in there with a 90-degree or a little hook pick and release that connector, or we can wait until we get the bumper down. It's a little bit cumbersome and clunky once the bumper is loose to try to get that harness out, and you could do some damage to the pins. So we're going to try to loosen that up now and do our best to show you guys. I can get under the main harness. It is the lower 6-pin connector. All right, we've got that 8-pin connector with these 6 wires in there. There is still one connection still in there, but don't worry about that. That is actually connected into the park distance control sensor. So there's not another harness on the other side, just this one large connector on the driver's side. Let's get the car back down, get that panel off the top, and get this bumper off the car. Back over at the front of the car, I do have a small plastic little pry tool, and there's a clip on the very back of the handle here. We're gonna push in up here while prying up on the actual handle. Careful not to damage or push too hard on that clip, because when you go to reopen the hood later on, you could have some issues. So make sure that that clip is in good standing and not missing. Once you have the hood handle off, we can go ahead and pry up on the sides here. You could definitely use the wedge to pry it out of the bumper clips if you have some issues. Once that is released, just pull straight out, and we are almost there. Once we have that panel off, there are 4 T30 screws along the top of the bumper. And then once you get those screws out, we can start releasing the bumper cover, making sure that the sides of the bumper are still nice and loose. And if you do have a friend handy, this would definitely be much easier with 2 people. And it feels like we got everything. Wow, this car hasn't had the bumper off in a while. Next up, we'll be taking out our air inlet from our airbox. We have this carbon fiber unit from 034 Motorsports, but if you have the factory unit, you'll normally have some T25s if I recall. We have some 3mm Allens here. I'm gonna try to carefully remove these without damaging our fancy airbox. Now we'll go ahead and remove the rest of our airbox. Obviously, if you have the stock airbox, it's gonna be a little bit differently than this, but feel free to refer to our air intake replacement video on the B9 chassis for further details on the stock intake. And very similar to the stock intake, once the piping is all loosened up, you can lift up on the box, removing the airbox and assembly, and make sure to remove these little rubber pieces and place them back into the body. We're going to come back underneath the fender liners and disconnect the connectors for the headlights. You'll notice a red locking tab on the main connector. We're just going to back that out slightly, depressing the connector and trying to get it off by holding onto the connector more than the wire harness. You really want to pull on the connector, not pulling the pins out of them. So this drain hose right here does need to come off as well. Quite frankly, just grab the hose and pull. You may need to work it with a screwdriver, but if you pull it consistently, you'll be okay. It does have a little barb on the back of the headlight. Be very careful not to break that barb off. And we're gonna do the same thing on the other side. Red tab on the connector, and if you pull the red tab all the way out like I did, you can reinsert it into the back of the connector. Next up, we're gonna get this bracing here above the front of the radiator. It's got a couple of T30s throughout the system, so we'll go ahead and remove those now. Next up, there's 2 more T30s that hold this bracket in, as well as the front radiator support piece here. These go through the headlight, as well as this bracket. On top of this front brace, we will have 4 13mm bolts. Hopefully they're not too terribly corroded, as it is a steel bolt inside an aluminum bracket. I was lucky and able to counterhold those with my hand. I imagine as this vehicle gets a little bit older, those are going to be a little bit more seized. You may need to counterhold that with an actual wrench or a socket. And before you go pull this bumper cover, we do need to take the harness off the front here. It does lead up under here, and there's a clip right here where you can kind of wiggle off and stick that off to the side. Get our nuts out of there, and then pull those 4 bolts up and away. Now that that is loosened up, we do still have 2 more T30s on the front here. So even with those bolts removed, we do still have some additional pieces here. These little plastic accordion looking things need to be pressed down, and then we'll slide them out of the way. Careful not to break them. And we'll do the same thing on the other side. And now with a little persuasion, we'll get the bumper off. Well, we're still not there. We need to take off some more hardware. So T30s across the top. And then the headlights do attach into here. This thing can come out of the way. Now we'll take off the T30 on the bottom of the headlight. And then one more on top. And then one more in the back. Carefully remove the headlight. And there we can finally see the bolts for the front radiator support. So we'll do the same thing on the other side to get some more access. Just like the other side, carefully remove the headlight. Make sure that we don't break anything or scratch the side of the fender there. Give ourselves a little more room. We're gonna slide this shroud for the Audi cooler over here. Again, you may not have this on your vehicle, but it was an option on ours, and simply just slide it towards the outside of the car on these oblong little fasteners. And before you put it back in, make sure to clean that out to make it as most efficient as you possibly can. Next up, we're going after this connector on the horn here. It may not be absolutely necessary, but it will make sure that we don't overextend this harness here when we pull the radiator support forward. Give myself a little more slack. I'll pull the harness out there and push up on the connector, depress the pin, and get that out of your way. That takes care of most of the stuff over here. We do need to release the charge air pipe on this side with a 7mm socket. Once you get that released, slide it off, and that takes care of everything on this side. Moving towards the center, we do have this high pressure sensor on the front of the radiator assembly here, specifically on the AC condenser. It's a little difficult to get out, but fish that back through the lock carrier, place that somewhere where you'll be able to see that later on. And down here on the side of the radiator, we do have another connector, which has a little bit different lock than we've done in this DIY, but the gray portion of the lock does come out. Pressing down and pulling that harness off. Horn up here, maybe easier with a pick to get that out because the connector is right against the horn. Panel tool, get this harness off the back of here and tuck that back into the headlight area. Just like the other side, we do have a 7mm on the charge pipe here. This one might be a little bit more difficult to remove. Oh, I'm getting a little bit luckier than I was expecting. If you're having difficulty with this, be careful, but you can use a 90-degree pick and work it around to loosen the connection. Next up, on the outsides of the radiator support, there are 2 T30s that tie it into the rest of the body. Get these both out of here. And now we'll start working on the main radiator support bolts. They do have a 16mm head, and there are 4 on either side of the frame horn. Before I go ahead and take the rest of them out, I'm going to match this bolt up with a little bit longer bolt, so once they are all released, I can simply slide this forward and do all the work that we need to do behind the radiator support. Now that I've matched up the M10x15 bolt, I've got about a 4-inch bolt here that I'm going to be replacing the outer lock carrier bolts with, feeding it in just a little bit, and these bolts aren't threaded all the way, so it'll make for nice and easy sliding of the lock carrier. I'm going to go ahead and do that on the other side. And just like a wheel hanger, we can go ahead and take the rest of the bolts out. And if you haven't already, go ahead and start draining the coolant. The lowest point on this radiator, although we do not have a drain, is the lower radiator hose. So with a screwdriver, I'm going to go in and release the clip that holds it in place. Once you get that released, work that coolant hose off. Make sure you have a drain bucket close by. And you can just let it drain slowly, because if you continue to release this thing quickly, it will make a mess. So we're gonna drain this all out, and I haven't even released the coolant cap yet, so it is keeping a little bit of tension in the cooling system, not allowing it to extremely quickly come out. I'm gonna crack the cap now, up top here. And as I release that, it should start to push some more coolant out. Now back over on the driver's side, there is a clip that holds the hood cable into the actual lock carrier. We're gonna just take this clip off to give ourselves a little more slack on that cable, freeing that up right there. Do not lose that clip. It is very hard to replace. So next up, we're gonna free up some more of that harness that we removed from the high pressure sensor in the front here with a 90-degree pick. I'm gonna get under the clip and just work that off. And in the same area, we do have this coolant line here. These coolant lines are very fragile. The entire line is made of plastic. We had an issue when we bought this car, and these were all ruptured and kind of placed back together. So these are rather new. You may have an issue with these actual coolant lines in your vehicle, so be very careful or have an extra one handy. Obviously, us removing that one was a lot easier than it will be for you after these are heat cycled and they've gone through a lot of expansion and contraction through thermodynamics. This will be a lot harder to remove, and the O-ring tends to expand in there, so be very, very careful. There is a small adapter that goes from the radiator to this line, so worst case scenario, you may be able to save the radiator and just have to replace that center adapter. But we've got that freed up. We're gonna move over to a connector on the lock carrier here, a little 2-pin, and then there's an airbag connector down here as well. Remove the little red lock, pull out, and we will set this whole harness off to the side. That takes care of most of the stuff over here. We'll go back over on the passenger side and take off the same connectors. These are upside down, so they'll be a little bit more difficult, but the same function is applied. That takes care of that, and we don't have any other harnesses similar to the other side. So now that we've got that freed up, you'll notice we do have a little tension on the driver's side from the upper radiator hose. May be able to get in there from this direction and free that clip up, whatever's easiest from either here or here. The actual release section, it does need to go towards the radiator, so keep that in mind. If you are working it from this way, it'll need to go towards the radiator. As you saw, once I released that clip, I was using a pry tool on the very outside of the coupler, prying against the radiator, because you can do damage. You just want to push that off while having another hand on it, kind of working it from either angle. It can be a little bit difficult, so keep that in mind. But we've freed up most of the coolant hoses here. There is still the radiator fan connector on the bottom, as well as 2 T30s holding a cross pipe for the cooling system onto the bottom that is also keeping the bottom of the radiator close to the vehicle. Once we get that off, we can pull this out and have ample room to get in here to do the main meat and potatoes of this job, which is the water pump, thermostat, the changeover valve, and inspect the vacuum system. Now, working on the driver's side, we're going to take this T30 off here. This might actually be a little bit easier from the bottom, and you may need some slim drive Torx bits. And once we get that out, we'll do the same thing on the passenger side. Maybe some additional coolant coming out of there. And then while that continues to drain up, we have this radiator connector here. Opening this to slide it out, and then we have to flip it over, unlock the red connector. A little bit easier with a pick, getting under there to release that. And separate those two. Now, this is particular to the vehicles that have the auxiliary cooler. There will be an additional hose over here on the driver's side of the radiator support. We're going to open up this clip, release that hose, and that should give us just enough room. So because we have air conditioning still in here, we don't need to take this all the way off. We certainly could get away with removing this bolt and positioning it out a little bit, while keeping in mind that these hard lines over here cannot flex too much. But this does still give us ample room to get to the water pump pulley, the thermostat changeover valve, and everything we're going to need to service under the engine bay. Now, before going ahead and taking the belts off, we're going to use the belt as a counterhold. And by that, I mean with the belt still installed and tensioned, we're going to use it to hold the pulley in place while we remove the 4 bolts for the main pulley. I'm not going to actually remove them all the way. We're just going to crack them loose, so it makes it a lot easier once the belt's off. With a T30, and if you have a 1/4 inch with some leverage, just break them free, and that'll make a lot easier when you get those apart. But now we got to get the main belt off. There are 2 belts on this vehicle. We're going to be starting with the water pump belt, and then to ensure that we don't get any coolant on the air conditioning belt and cause that to cause any squeals down the road, we'll be removing that as well. Before we go ahead and take the belt off, it might be wise to just take a picture of this real quick or do a little drawing to ensure that we put the belt on the exact correct direction. This one's not fairly complicated, but on many vehicles where you have a lot of accessories in one place, it might be wise to make sure that you put the belt on the exact same way it came off. With a 16mm socket or a wrench, whichever you have on hand, we're going to be counterclockwise turning the tensioner while holding that in place. Remove it from the alternator, and up and away it goes. We've got that one out of the way. In order to get to the air conditioning tensioner, there is a cap right here. With a pick or a screwdriver, we're just going to pry the cap off. And in the center of that, there is a 13mm, and there's a T45 or a T50. There's a Torx for the tensioner in order to tension it, and just keep in mind that that Torx does have to be at the downward position opposite the bolt. It is a little bit of an eccentric, so when you loosen it, it will pop up in one direction or the other. And once you loosen it, you'll see it does shift off to one side. Back it out a few turns. So the tensioner is in fact a T55. Put one in there, and then you'll notice it goes 180 degrees until that belt gets loose. This one does not have as much involved, but keep in mind that the belt does go below the tensioner, below the roller, and around the outside of the AC compressor. And as we did before, we've already loosened up the pulley bolts, and they should be almost finger tight. I do see some coolant staining where our water pump was leaking onto the crank pulley here, but let's get this pulley off and take a good look at the actual water pump itself. So since we already cracked those free, you should be able to hold it with one hand. And go ahead and remove the 4 T30 bolts in the water pump pulley. And you'll notice that there is Loctite in those bolts from factory, so these will be fairly tight. As you saw, I removed them with the belt still on, which was very beneficial in keeping that pulley in one place. With a small pick, careful not to damage the hose. You can see there's already some fluid leaking out, and I have a feeling we're going to have coolant in our vacuum system. Oh no. Working the pick around that, and then we'll pull it off. Well, it looks like that may have been coolant leaking externally. Let's take a look in there. Well, as we suspected, there are trace amounts of coolant in our vacuum system. And this is just the beginning of where it starts to cause some problems. In my right hand, this is the boost control solenoid, which operates the vacuum controlled wastegate actuator on the top of the turbocharger here. This line right here. Once the coolant makes it from the water pump, it then travels through the vacuum system, making its way up to that solenoid here, rupturing the diaphragm in there, and then potentially rupturing the diaphragm in the wastegate controller. Furthermore, coolant can travel throughout the system into the vacuum pump over here, as well as the reservoir underneath the cylinder head. So it is advised to really, if you have one of these vehicles, keep an eye on coolant migration through the vacuum system. And there are various points in which you can check. There are several connections or hose barbs that you can take off and see how far the coolant has made it if you're going from an old coolant pump to the new coolant pump. In our case, there is not a lot of coolant in this line, but I will probably be looking into our wastegate solenoid. We've already put a new turbo on there, so hopefully the water pump did not get into our wastegate actuator. If it did, we probably would have got a P0299 underboost fault, and I probably would have been looking in this direction. I've seen all over the internet and all over service records that the wastegate actuator does get full of coolant, in which you'll see some coolant staining here. So even before you get to this point, coming down to the passenger bank, you can look right behind the turbo inlet. There will be this solenoid here, and typically you'll see some coolant draining right out of this unit. So that is a telltale sign that your coolant system is starting to leak coolant into the vacuum system and starting to wreak havoc. So let's continue to get this thing apart and see what else we have to replace other than some of this. Next up, we're going to release the wire harness around the fake dipstick tube. That's right, I said fake dipstick tube. No dipstick in this car, but they still put the tube there. When you get that harness released, that'll give you just enough room to get into the back and get a T30 from this crossover pipe, as well as the T30 right here. With that wiring harness loosened up a little bit, we're able to get into that T30. Crack it loose. Be sure not to drop this one because it may go down into no man's land and you'll be out a T30. You've got one more right here. Once you get that lower one off of this crossover pipe, there's another T30 right here. And let's see if this is gonna, yep, that'll release nicely now. May need to pry the pipe away from the actual water pump here. Screwdriver, that's a fairly large O-ring on that side right here. All right, now we're gonna have to keep dissecting some of this harness. We've got the map thermostat connector right here. Underneath there will be a little lock on the actual connector, similar to one like this. Release that lock, it is upside down. Pull the gray lock out, squeeze the connector, take it off. There's one more little snap connector on the map thermostat here as well. We've got this changeover valve we've got to slide out of the way. You may need a little persuasion to get it off. Doesn't look like coolant migrated out of there. We might be in luck. We may be able to just get away with cleaning some of the vacuum lines from the water pump and not having to go ahead and replace the entire system. But we're glad we caught it when it did. So with the vacuum system removed, kind of kick that off to the side. Another wire harness that's kind of tucked in behind the water pump. There are 3 T30s on the map thermostat. There are 3 T30s for the changeover valve. We do have to get this crossover pipe on top of the water pump out. That also leads into the changeover valve. There's a T30 underneath here, and there's one on here. So we're gonna get this crossover pipe out first, then we'll get the water pump out, then we'll get the map thermostat out, and then we'll get the changeover valve out. I'm gonna start with this crossover pipe here, get this out. We're gonna be using a T30 for pretty much the rest of this job. It may have various lengths and different bits, but use whatever you have at your disposal. Now we're gonna get into the T30 down here. Ours looks like it's got a little dirt in there. So to make sure I get a good bite, and I'm gonna clean that out first. Firm grip on that. It's going to be a little bit of a pain if you got to extract that one. I would also like to mention that Audi did us a solid and put 2 different size bolts in there. So do not mix those up. The shorter bolt is going to go into the pipe that attaches to the water pump, and the longer bolt is going to go into the flanged end of that pipe. Once the pipe is more or less free, it's going to be a lot of wiggling, pulling, and tugging to get it out. It is rather flexible, so be careful you don't damage it. Pull it out of the water pump first, and then it's going to be a little bit of a wiggle to get it out of the changeover valve. There we go. Set this one off to the side. While we're still over here, we're going to continue on the T30 surrounding the water pump. For reference, that last bolt we were working on that was very difficult to show you is located right here in between the vacuum nipple and the weep hole. So the T30 surrounding it are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bolts holding that flange in place. Now let's go ahead and get this pump off. Make sure your coolant bucket is in a good spot because it's going to leak out everything else. You may need to pry this off with something a little bit more forceful. Oh, look at that. It fell off for me. Plastic didn't disconnect. It was simply just leaking. It's got this wild gasket, but there's some oil and coolant leaking out of there, probably from when our oil filter housing was leaking. Check that DIY as well. Yeah, this is a bad water pump. This is a really, really bad water pump. Next up, we'll get this thermostat out of our way. I've already released the changeover valve from the bracket, so we're just going to push that off to the side and get these T30s out for the map thermostat. Crack them all loose. A screwdriver or a pry bar or a panel tool. try to get in behind this thermostat and start working it around the corners. There we go. Make sure the coolant bucket will catch it. There's still some more in there. And there's the rest of it. And now that that's out of our way, next up is the changeover valve here. See if I can get a little more lighting in here. There are 3 T30s on this component as well. One here, one behind the vacuum line that you have to move the vacuum line a little out of the way to get to. And there is one last T30 hidden in here, which we'll have to feel around for. And now that we've got all the hardware out, we can take out the changeover valve as well. Does seem like it does have another fastener in there, but the unit itself is flanged into the head. So you're fighting the O-ring on here. Even though you got the bolts released, keep in mind this may be a little bit difficult to remove. Generally, when these start to leak, you'll see in this area, there's a cover here I'll pop off where coolant is actually leaking through the hinge, making its way down and around this. And furthermore, you can get some coolant leaking into here, causing that diaphragm to leak from the water pump. So coolant will leak externally here, getting into here from the water pump internally, and then sending it throughout the entire system. So we're going ahead and trying to alleviate any potential issues from future owners of this vehicle. But we'll take a closer look at that thermostat seal as we do have it handy, but it is kind of a replace when necessary type of situation. So we'll let the coolant drain down for a little bit, clean everything up here, and give the vacuum system a little bit more thorough inspection and see if we have to replace the rest of these lines, solenoids, actuators, and what have you. Now, before we get going, putting everything back together, let's make sure that the vacuum system doesn't have any coolant leading through the rest of it. We did see a little bit in that vacuum line at the main water pump, but not enough for concern. So we're going to go to the first solenoid that normally gets coolant in it when the water pump does fail, and just take a quick inspection and blow through that line to make sure that we have no residual coolant in there and clean it out real good. Making sure that the solenoid also doesn't have any coolant, because if the solenoid has coolant, then there's potential that from that solenoid, it has wicked through the rest of the system. So I'm going to take this connector off, releasing this gray clip, and then pulling that connector off. On here, there is a little metal clip, if you will. I'm going to use a plastic wedge to get this off, or trying not to mar up our nice turbo inlet from 034 here. Once we get that free, we can pop this harness up just a little bit. It's on a grommet. I have to release this oxygen sensor here. Kind of put 2 hands behind that. There we go. It's just freeing it up just enough so we can get this off of the stand in here. Get a light in there so you guys can see. We're gonna get behind this and pry it off of the stand. There's a connector back here that's a little difficult to disconnect, but if you just wiggle the solenoid up and away into a little bit better position to get that connector off. 90-degree pick will release the connector. Get this solenoid in a little bit more accessible area, and we're going to get this vacuum line off the bottom. Careful not to nick the vacuum line, because if this doesn't have coolant in it, we are going to reuse it. Just kind of working around with a pick patiently. There we go. And you don't want to break the barb on here either. It does look a little moist. I don't see any dry coolant in the area, but there's definitely a little bit of liquid in this position here. It's kind of hard to see. Normally you'll see some dried coolant. It's kind of white, but doesn't look like much has gone past this solenoid. Let's tap it on the bench and see if we've got any fluid coming out. I don't have any dried coolant in there, but there's certainly a potential for this to fail just from the coolant migration. You can see a little bit of moisture in there, not much, but we could probably keep looking and see if anything has migrated anywhere else. The next path of the coolant migration from the actual coolant pump through the system is, as we discussed, the boost control solenoid and then to the wastegate. The other point you can check is this T down here, which is a little bit more accessible than removing that solenoid there. go ahead again carefully with a pick to get in between the plastic and the rubber without damaging the hose. And it looks like we're pretty dry here. As you can see, there's certainly some coolant migration and some oil from our leaking oil filter housing that's migrated in here too. So there's definitely potential that there could be some coolant in this solenoid. So let's keep looking here. Kind of hard to see in this one because it's definitely got some coolant on the outside. Inside of the diaphragm, it's kind of hard to say, but it doesn't look like there's a lot of dried coolant. If there is any, it may just still be very recent. However, we can check all these solenoids with a vacuum pump and ensure that their operation is good before we put everything back together. So before we go ahead and condemn this vacuum system, we'll make sure all these lines are cleared, but we want to make sure these solenoids are good as well. You can either use a hand vacuum pump and check the solenoids for vacuum, or simply grab a piece of hose or straw. On the one that was up here, as well as the one that's down here, this should hold vacuum and this should lead to the vent on the top. So I'll put a piece of hose on the one here and blow through this. And then if you put the hose on the bottom one, I wouldn't recommend sucking on this one as you could ingest some coolant. So you can simply blow lightly on this one. If you blow too hard, you could rupture the diaphragm, but it at least checks the ability for this to seal, because when electricity is applied, it is then open. So at rest, this should be closed. And that one seems okay. Again, this is just a quick, cheap, easy test while you have it apart, deciding whether or not you need to go ahead and replace all of these. This bottom one, I'm going to attach to first. That one seems pretty good. Take the hose off the side, or I can go into this and just hold it in place, and that should blow out of the vent. And it does. Let's see if it comes out. You just want to make sure that it does not come out of the vacuum port. So when you blow through the side, it comes out here, then the diaphragm's ruptured. Same thing if you blow through here and it comes out here. The only way it should come out is through the vent in the top. So both of these are okay. I'll take a second to take these vacuum lines and run some brake cleaner through them to make sure that there's nothing else dried up in there, and we'll get ready to put everything back together.